I think Christians have got to look at what nation has he put us in, and how do we make it better? How do we bless it? Any nation that has Christians in it ought to be blessed because they've got people of God in it. And I think that's just a biblical principle. Whatever Christian you are, whatever nation you're in, that nation ought to be better because you're in it. And Christians just make places better. That's what they do.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is it that you wanted to get across in this book, The Solomon Promise?
Well, last year when it seemed as if everything was coming apart at the seams, a publisher came to us that had produced this book and just said, so many Christians are discouraged these days. All they can see is all the darkness, all the evil that seems to be pervading the nation, and Christians are just wondering what's gone wrong. Is there any hope? Here we have all these churches, all these Christians, and yet things are getting worse, not better. What do we do about that? And they remembered this book that actually came out of originally my dad. They asked us as a publisher, what are three of the most powerful sermons your dad ever preached? And that was really hard to try to figure out. But there were some sermons on revival that my dad preached that, he wasn't even finished preaching, and the whole altar was just filled with people weeping and on their faces before God. And so we took three of those messages and then kind of transformed it into a book. But the basis of it, I was there to hear him speak and preach these sermons, and I'll tell you what, it was electrifying. And so it's not a long book, but it is. My dad agonized about getting that word from God, and you could tell because before he'd even gotten his sermon finished yet, the place was just completely coming unglued, and people are weeping and flooding to the front because they knew they just heard the truth and they needed to get right with the Holy God.
Well, and when you talk about hearing the truth and having that right relationship with God, I think that there are certain, and I committed my life to Christ when I was very young, grew up in a Christian home, attended church, and really renewed my commitment to Christ just before I graduated from high school. So, when you look at the elements of the gospel, you know that there are certain elements such as walking in holiness, being a disciple, following Christ, exhibiting the character of Christ, confession of sin, identifying sin, and realize that I need to have my relationship with God right. We don't hear that much, it seems like, in popular Christian culture these days about some of these elements with respect to holiness, sin, or, as you contend in the book, the fear of God. In fact, the driving principle, it seems, is that in our nation, we've lost the fear of God.
Yeah.
So how do we recapture that?
Well, it's not that unbelievers have lost the fear of God. It's God's people have lost the fear.
But they never had it. Unbelievers never had it.
Yeah, and it's God's people that now treat sin lightly. My dad always said, if you have a high view of God, you're going to take a very serious view of sin. But if you begin excusing your sin, you begin laughing and making jokes about it, you talk about, well, I know God wants me to do this and I'm going to get around to it sometime, then that means you've got a low view of God. And if God's people don't even have a high view of God, then how are they ever going to convince lost people to have a high view themselves? And so that it comes like Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 6, he was a church attender, he was a God believer, but in Isaiah 6, he had a fresh vision of God as he really was, and that absolutely transformed him. And all he could say was, woe is me. And I'll tell you, there's a lot of American Christians, myself included, who needs a woe is me moment encounter with God to see him as he is. And I would just say to your listeners, no matter what happened in the elections last year, God is still on his throne. He didn't lose his seat. He's still ruling, he's still in charge, and if we get a clear view of him, he'll give us marching orders, and he knows how to extend his kingdom in our day and in this land.